She stood in the center of the boardroom, holding a printed report no one had bothered to read. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago, but inside that glass tomb, only one thing echoed louder than the silence: his laughter. Not a polite chuckle, not a slip of amusement. A full, jaw-wide, breathless laugh from the CEO himself, Ethan Rowley. The kind of laugh that tells the room it's okay to mock you. That makes your work, your warnings, your 7 years of building systems that kept the company clean feel like a bad joke at someone else's party. Eleanor Gray had been trying to explain why a batch of vendor payments looked suspicious, why logs had vanished, why Server 19, a supposedly retired archive system, had been quietly purged just hours after she submitted her final audit. But no one cared. They were too busy watching Ethan lean back in his leather chair like he was the star of a TED Talk. "You're overthinking it, Eleanor," he said, waving her 70-page report like a napkin. "We're scaling, not running a monastery." Laughter erupted, not just from him, but from the people she once mentored, people who knew better. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. Not anger, not fear, something colder. Something quiet, the kind of silence that comes before a controlled burn. But before we get into what she did next, where in the world are you listening from today? Have you ever spoken up and been dismissed like you were nothing? Drop a comment below. Someone else out there might need to know they're not alone. Ethan Rowley didn't fear policies, he feared inertia. Or at least that's what he told every journalist who praised him for turning Alvanta Tech into one of Chicago's fastest-growing startups. But for people like Eleanor, who had built the company's data integrity frameworks from the ground up, his kind of growth came with a cost, one they were always the first to pay. Ethan walked through the office like a man too busy for friction. He spoke in words like velocity and optimization and disruption, and rarely, if ever, mentioned compliance unless he was cutting corners around it. His signature was on a dozen initiatives meant to streamline outdated infrastructure, which was corporate code for delete anything that slows us down. Legacy servers, audit logs, protocols she had spent years writing, revising, defending. And that's what made Server 19 a problem. To him, it was a dinosaur, a cold storage backup machine that burned electricity and held on to junk no one would ever look at. But to Eleanor, it was the last unfiltered witness in a company that had learned how to hide in plain sight. In his mind, policies were paperwork, bureaucratic clutter to be tidied before the IPO roadshow. He didn't know or didn't care that some of those policies had legal weight. He certainly didn't read the retention clauses buried in the fine print. What Ethan did understand was how to build loyalty, the kind that didn't come from trust, but from fear. Promotions were fast, but so were exits. Teams moved like shadows. Questions were unwelcome. Compliance, he claimed, belonged to a slower era. And yet, when he spoke in town halls, people listened, because he was charming, ambitious, ruthless. He sold the future like it was a product you could download, and he made sure no one looked back. But Eleanor always looked back. That was her job. And she'd begun to see the pattern, the invisible edits, the convenient losses, the timed reshuffles that always seemed to happen right before an audit. She didn't say anything. Not yet. But that week, when she passed by Ethan's office and saw him laughing with legal about the clutter cleanup, she stopped. She stared at the door for a moment, and she made a copy, just in case. It came as a calendar invite. Subject line, quick sync, 10:15 a.m., HR room 2. No agenda, no context, just those 2 words. Eleanor Gray knew exactly what it meant. She arrived on time, hair tied back, no makeup, flats instead of heels. Her outfit, plain, gray blazer, black slacks, said more than words ever could. I know what this is, let's not pretend otherwise. Inside the room sat Lisa from HR, all lavender-scented anxiety and polite discomfort. Beside her, a man in a dark charcoal suit, face like a blank slate. Not internal counsel, no, they'd brought someone external. That's how she knew this wasn't a conversation. It was an execution. Eleanor Lisa began smiling too wide. "Thanks so much for coming in." The man slid a folder across the table. "Your role has been identified as redundant under Alvanta's pre-IPO strategic realignment." She didn't flinch. "We're offering a generous severance package," he continued, "contingent on signing the included confidentiality agreement, non-disparagement clause, and mutual release. Standard terms." Eleanor didn't open the folder. She didn't need to. She just said calmly, "I'll sign on one condition." The man blinked. Lisa looked confused. "I want a printed copy of my final audit submission, email metadata included, timestamps, attachments, unedited." "That's highly unusual," Lisa murmured. "So is deleting audit logs," Eleanor replied softly. The silence that followed was longer than anyone expected, but eventually Lisa nodded. "We'll make the print." She signed the documents without another word, took her copy, left her badge on the table. No goodbyes, no final emails, no coffee cups to pack. Back in her car, Eleanor sat still, HVAC humming, fingers motionless on the steering wheel. She had just been erased, made redundant by the same company she'd helped build from the ground up. But they'd forgotten something. They forgot who had written the original data retention policy, and they definitely forgot about what was still stored on server 19. The next morning, she opened a blank email draft. To slane@sec.gov. Subject, just a heads up. Then she attached one file and hit send. The apartment was quiet when Eleanor got home. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that settles in after something's been broken. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't take off her blazer. She just stood there, keys in hand, in the middle of the room, feeling the shape of the silence. Then she walked straight to the kitchen. She opened the freezer, reached past a half-empty bag of peas and a forgotten tub of mint chip ice cream, and pulled out a small white envelope tucked behind a vodka bottle. Inside was a USB stick, labeled in neat handwriting, Data Retention Policy, Signed Copy, 2021. Still sealed, still untouched. She sat at the table and plugged it into her old laptop. No Wi-Fi, no cloud backups. This machine hadn't touched the internet in over a year. That was the point. A single file, one PDF. Alvanta Internal Data Policy Final Notarized .pdf. She opened it. Clause 4.2.1a. All compliance-relevant logs must be archived in duplicate and stored on secure legacy server infrastructure with snapshots retained for no less than 7 years. Clause 4.2.1b. Deletion of any mirrored data must be logged approved by 2 senior compliance officers and retained for audit visibility. She'd written those lines herself, reviewed them with legal, countersigned them with the company's former CTO. Stamped, filed, uploaded, distributed. But the most important copy, the one no one else knew about, was this one. She took a breath, then another, because somewhere, buried in the company's shiny new compliance dashboard, someone had tried to erase her work. Not just the policy, but the logs, the signatures, the trail. They were counting on the fact that no one would keep a copy of a 3-year-old internal policy. They didn't know Eleanor kept everything. And they had no idea what else she'd saved or where. Down the hall in her closet, there was a locked box. Inside it, something even Ethan didn't know existed. But that would come later. First, she had to wake up the server no one believed still mattered. It was nearly midnight when Eleanor composed the email. The glow of her old laptop was the only light in the room. The air was still heavy, like the kind of quiet before a storm breaks over the lake. She sat in a hoodie and socks, legs curled under her on the couch, eyes fixed on the blinking cursor, waiting for her words. She typed slowly, carefully, to slane@sec.gov, subject, just a heads up. She hadn't spoken to Sophia Lane in over a year. Not since the compliance summit in Dallas, where they'd snuck out of a breakout session on ethical leadership in fast-moving markets to grab overpriced wine and vent about men who thought data retention was a spreadsheet problem. Sophia had always been sharp, quiet but observant, the kind of person who never asked questions she didn't already have half the answer to. Eleanor didn't write much, just a few lines. "I'm not making accusations, but I thought you might want to take a look at these before they disappear for good." She attached a redacted version of her final audit. Nothing explosive on the surface, just enough to raise a brow. A few vendor patterns, a missing signature or two, payment timings that didn't line up, no finger pointing, just breadcrumbs. Then she added one final sentence. "If anyone ever asks about Server 19, tell them to start on page 12. She hovered over the send button. Her chest felt tight, not from fear, but from the kind of pressure that comes when you push something out of your hands and into the world. You can't take it back after that. You just wait and watch. She hit send. Then she sat in the dark, listening to nothing but the sound of her own breath and the faint tick of the kitchen clock. No reply, no bounce back, no out of office, just silence. But it wasn't empty silence. It felt like a wire had been tripped somewhere, like a circuit had been closed. Something invisible had started moving, not fast, but deep. And in the stillness of that moment, Eleanor knew someone was going to read that page. The question was, when? At 5:42 the next morning, Eleanor woke up without an alarm. Not from stress, not from a bad dream, just awareness, the kind your body learns after years of catching problems before they explode. She brewed a mug of black coffee, the same chipped ceramic one that said auditors do it by the book, and sat down at the small maple kitchen table she'd inherited from her grandmother. The early light was soft through the curtains. The world outside felt quiet, safe. But something in her chest buzzed like static, faint but steady. She opened her laptop. No news from Sophia. No replies. No noise at all. And yet something felt different, like the air had shifted ever so slightly. She navigated to a folder labeled simply ARC. Inside it was clean, versioned, sorted. She'd mirrored and archived every quarterly snapshot from Server 19 before they tried to optimize it out of existence. It had been part paranoia, part principle, but mostly habit. Eleanor never trusted systems she didn't build herself. And buried in the Q2 2022 folder, there it was, a PDF, Alvanta_internal data policy, final notarized. Again, clause 4.2.1a, clause 4.2.1b, identical to the one she'd stored in the freezer, because redundancy wasn't just a backup, it was strategy. But this copy wasn't the only thing Server 19 had kept. 3 years ago, Eleanor had written a small script, nothing fancy, just a line of code slipped into a weekly cron job, the kind of thing no one noticed unless they knew where to look. It logged every deletion attempt, who made it, when they made it, where the request came from, and quietly, silently, it sent a carbon copy to a blind FTP archive she'd owned. It was the digital equivalent of a ghost witness, invisible, silent, and impossible to erase. They thought Server 19 was dead. What they didn't know was that she'd taught it to scream when someone tried to kill it. She stared at the logs now, eyes narrowing. A contractor login, a 3:17 a.m. purge, an IP routed through Virginia, and the signature, not a fake, not a mistake, just one name. Her hands stilled over the keyboard. This wasn't about proving something anymore. This was about timing, because if someone knocked now, she was ready to answer. 2 days later, the email came. Not to Eleanor, but to every inbox at Alvanta's corporate headquarters. Subject, internal notice, regulatory inquiry body. The SEC has initiated a routine request for compliance documentation in connection with our upcoming public listing. All departments are expected to fully cooperate. Routine. That was the word they used, but Eleanor knew better. So did anyone who'd worked in compliance long enough to smell smoke before the fire. You don't ask for legacy logs from a decommissioned server unless someone whispers where to dig. And buried in the official SEC request was one precise sentence. Please provide a complete backup of all mirrored compliance data from Server 19, including user action logs for the past 36 months. No broad phrasing, no vague scope, just a scalpel aimed at the exact nerve. From what Eleanor heard through whispers and texts from former colleagues, the leadership team at Alvanta tried to play it cool. Ethan scheduled a last-minute town hall, smiled too wide on camera, and called it an opportunity for alignment and transparency. He spoke of confidence, agility, and trust in process. But behind the scenes, things weren't so polished. The CTO locked his office door, legal froze all outgoing communication. And finance, they tried to locate the most recent audit trail, only to discover that the last complete backup was from 16 months ago. Meanwhile, the data team scrambled, insisting Server 19 had been phased out as part of strategic modernization. No one could explain who authorized the purge or where the mirrored logs had gone. Some said it was a systems bug, others claimed it was already handled, but the SEC wasn't buying it. Because someone somewhere had told them exactly where to look. Eleanor didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She just closed her laptop and went for a walk, coat buttoned, headphones in hands, steady. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't the one chasing the truth. Now the truth was chasing them, and it had a badge. Eleanor didn't rush. She never did. The morning after the SEC request hit Alvanta's inboxes, she brewed her coffee the same way, sat at the same maple table, and opened the same aging laptop she always used when things needed to stay offline. She didn't feel victorious. Not yet. This wasn't the finish line. This was the moment just before the first domino falls. The air was sharp with anticipation, but her hands were steady. She opened the folder labeled Failsafe. Inside were subfolders named by quarter. Each one contained logs, backups file histories, and a curated list of deletion events. Every entry cross-referenced with a timestamp, user ID, remote IP, and where possible, a signature trail. The kind of documentation that didn't just tell a story, it built a case. She scrolled to the purge request from 3:17 a.m., a ghost contractor, a masked IP routed through Virginia, deletion actions targeting Server 19's compliance mirror, signed by Ethan Raleigh. And then there was the script she'd embedded long ago, the one that created a mirrored copy of every deletion event and sent it to a blind encrypted FTP repository under her name. Every file they thought they erased, every log they tried to wipe, it was all still here. Quiet, tidy, undeniable. Eleanor bundled it into a package, an internal memo template she designed years ago, just professional enough to look like it came from inside. She stripped the metadata, renamed the file alvanta_compliance_issue_internal.pdf. No dramatic subject line, no emotional language. Just a simple message routed through 3 encrypted proxies and delivered straight to the contact Sophia had provided. Per your request, attached are mirrored log deletions related to Server 19, including timestamps and associated access credentials. Clauses 4.2.1a and 4.2.b were in effect at the time of purge. She hit send. Then she leaned back, staring at the quiet hum of her refrigerator. Outside, the wind shifted against the glass. Somewhere in a boardroom downtown, people were sweating under suits. Papers were being printed, lawyers were pacing. But here, in her kitchen, the only sound was the quiet hum of a folder finally speaking for itself. And she hadn't even opened the fireproof box yet. The news didn't break like thunder. It arrived like a slow leak, a line of code quietly failing in the background until someone finally notices the system isn't working anymore. By midweek, the ripple had become a current. Financial blogs started whispering about irregularities at Alvanta. One headline read, SEC inquiry targets legacy server data. Another, missing logs could delay Alvanta's IPO timeline. But the real shift didn't come from the press. It came from the money. By Friday morning, 2 institutional investors had pulled out. A hedge fund issued a statement citing concerns over transparency and data governance. And the placeholder for Alvanta's ticker quietly vanished from the NASDAQ preview list. Inside the company, things unraveled faster than anyone expected. Emergency meetings were called. PR firms drafted talking points no one dared deliver. And Ethan, once the face of forward-thinking leadership, canceled his town hall and stopped showing up altogether. One employee leaked an internal Slack message to a subreddit for startup workers. The post was short, anonymous, and brutal. Ethan told us 2 weeks ago to clean out old logs, said it was legacy garbage slowing down the pipeline. When someone asked about Server 19, he laughed, said, if Eleanor wanted them kept, maybe she shouldn't have walked out. The screenshot spread like wildfire. Reddit, LinkedIn, Twitter, then MarketWire. Within hours, the headline changed tone. Insider confirms log deletions tied to fired auditor. CEO under review after SEC request pinpoints missing archive. Eleanor didn't post anything. Didn't share, didn't like, didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her name was already there, buried in the footnotes of the original policy, still filed with the SEC, time-stamped, and signed. The same one Ethan had tried to erase. The same one she'd printed, sealed, and stored years ago. And now, with everything falling apart, there was still one thing left unopened: the fireproof lockbox in her closet. She walked down the hall, turned the key, and lifted the lid. Because if they thought this was the collapse, they hadn't seen the foundation crack yet. The fireproof box opened with a soft click. Nothing dramatic, no sound effect worthy of a movie. Just the dull metal thunk of a lock giving way. Inside were a few essentials: tax forms, an expired passport, 2 thumb drives, and 1 sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front was her own. Do not open unless they start lying. She remembered sealing it. Late 2021. Back when she still believed things could be fixed from the inside. Back when Ethan's title still felt earned. But she'd seen it coming. The way leadership changed tone every time she brought up retention compliance or server architecture. So she mailed it to herself. Not to be dramatic, but to be prepared. She broke the seal. Inside was a pristine printed copy of Alvanta's original internal data policy, the one she had co-authored, signed, and had notarized. The very document that had quietly disappeared from the public policy repository shortly after she left. She flipped to page 12. There at the bottom, next to clause 4.21a and 4.21b, was her name. Eleanor M. Gray, policy author, Audit, stamped, witnessed, filed. The document didn't just outline the rules, it proved they existed, and that the company had once followed them before someone made the decision to wipe them clean. This wasn't a rogue system bug, it was erasure, calculated and convenient. What made it worse wasn't the deletion. It was the arrogance, the assumption that no one would remember, no one would question, and no one would care. But someone had remembered, and someone had cared enough to keep a copy just in case. That evening, she scanned the document and archived it. Then she uploaded it to an anonymous, secure drop used by regulatory watchdogs and journalists. No watermark, no comment, no signature. Just truth planted like a quiet seed in a field about to catch fire. She closed her laptop. And across town, the SEC had already scheduled their next move. Because now that the name had reappeared, someone was going to have to answer for what they'd tried to forget. The conference room wasn't especially large. No fancy artwork, no sweeping view. Just beige walls, a projector screen, and 3 government-issued chairs facing one man who had once believed he was untouchable. Ethan Rowley sat at the far end of the table, hands folded, shirt slightly rumpled, tie too tight. He looked smaller now, not physically, but in presence. The kind of shrinking that happens when confidence turns into calculation and calculation fails. Across from him sat the SEC, 3 agents, suits pressed, faces unreadable. One of them, a woman with her hair in a steel gray bun, clicked the projector remote without a word. The screen flickered to life. Slide 1, Clause 4.2.1b of Alvanta's Internal Data Retention Policy. All deletions of mirrored compliance backups must be logged, reviewed, and approved by 2 senior officers. Logs must be retained for a minimum of 7 years. Slide 2, a scanned notarized document. Author, Eleanor M. Gray. Date, August 12, 2021. Filed with the SEC as part of Alvanta's compliance disclosure. The woman didn't raise her voice. She simply asked Mr. Raleigh, "Where is the backup for server 19? Ethan opened his mouth, then paused. "It must have been decommissioned during system modernization." Another pause. "Was that action logged? Was it approved by 2 officers? Was a retention waiver filed?" Silence. He reached for his water, missed the cap, spilled half the bottle down his front. His hand trembled slightly as he blotted his shirt with a napkin, but the room didn't move. No reaction. No sympathy, because now it wasn't about opinions or strategy or forward-thinking jargon. It was about proof. And the one person they tried to erase had become the author of the very policy now crushing their defense. Across town, in a much quieter room, Eleanor watered the rosemary plant on her windowsill. The late afternoon light spilled over the countertop. The radio played soft jazz and news headlines faded in between the notes. One story caught her attention. Alvanta's IPO remains indefinitely suspended following regulatory scrutiny over missing compliance records. She stirred her tea. No smile, no celebration, just peace. Because some endings don't need applause. They just need silence and a signature on page 12. But there was still one more thing she needed to do. Not for revenge, for record keeping. The final piece wasn't loud. There was no press conference, no LinkedIn post, no dramatic confrontation in a lobby full of investors. Eleanor simply opened her laptop, found the original audit report, the one Ethan had laughed at in front of the board, and exported it to PDF. File name, Alvanta_final_audit_Gray_submitted 2023.pdf. No edits, no highlights, every missing log, every ghost payment, every unanswered question, still exactly where she had left it. Then she uploaded it quietly to a secure public drop used by journalists, analysts, and watchdog groups, a place where stories didn't need names to be heard. A place where truth could live without needing an audience. She didn't sign it, didn't watermark it, didn't attach a message. Because this was never about vengeance. It was about clarity, about record-keeping. Some people think policies are dry, lifeless things, words you print once, then forget. But Eleanor knew better. She knew that when written right and followed well, a policy can outlive everyone who ignores it. And in the end, it didn't need her to defend it. It only needed to be activated. Ethan Rowley resigned under leadership restructuring. Alvanta's IPO was shelved indefinitely. A new interim compliance team was brought in, the kind that reads every page, including the ones people tried to delete. And Eleanor She kept walking forward. No press, no interviews, just steady work, quiet mornings, and the certainty that sometimes the truth doesn't shout, it just waits. And when the moment comes, it executes itself. So here's something to think about. What would you do if the system you helped build was turned against you? Would you walk away? Or would you trust that what you created would know how to speak when the time was right? Let me know in the comments. Maybe your story will help someone else find the courage to hold the line.